Welcome to Bethlem Museum of the Mind's virtual book club, where for the next 3 weeks we'll be discussing Robert Burton's Anatomy of Melancholy, the classic self-help book published 399 years ago. Now, you might consider the Anatomy of Melancholy to be a slightly depressing choice for a book club, especially in the circumstances we are all in at the time this is being filmed, April 2020, which are circumstances of enforced social isolation and shutdown during the current coronavirus outbreak. Maybe you'd prefer to read something less serious, something light and humorous, perhaps even flippant, something to help take our minds off our present difficulties. Well, believe it or not, there is a great deal of humour in the Anatomy of Melancholy, but at the same time, Robert Burton was looking out for readers who were prepared to face reality. Know your enemy was his watchword. If we don't dare to look melancholia in the face, if we can't bear to ask the question, what's the worst that could happen and how would we handle it? If we would prefer to amuse ourselves to death, then paradoxically we're less well fortified against our difficulties. My name's Colin Gale and I'm the director of Bethlem Museum of the Mind. I'm standing next to a 1660 edition of Robert Burton's famous book that was on display in the museum for about a year and took pride of place in a temporary exhibition of ours, which was named after the book. And behind me, I think you'll be able to see Caius Gabriel Cibber's famous statue of Melancholy Madness, which was a landmark of early modern London. The Anatomy of Melancholy was a landmark of its own, a 17th century bestseller. It went through many editions in and after Robert Burton's lifetime. Each time it increased in size and ended up numbering well over 1,000 pages. You'll be relieved to hear that I'm not suggesting the book club reads the 1,000-page version, though I guess you can if you want. There is a modern reprint of the book in its entirety. But for most people, reading the whole thing may induce melancholy rather than to reduce it. So instead, I recommend you read one or other abridged versions, which were both published in 2013. One, which was adapted for the stage by Stan's Cafe, a community theatre company in Birmingham, and one which was published by Hesperus Press in the same year, 2013, and contains an introduction by Nicholas Robbins. When I quote from the Anatomy of Melancholy in this video, and in the ones to follow, I'll try to give page references from both the Stan's Cafe edition and the Nicholas Robbins version. If you're watching this and don't yet have a copy of the book, I suggest you try to obtain the Robbins version, not because it's any better than the other one, but just because the chances of you finding a copy are better, especially if you look out for an ebook version. Of course, you're welcome to simply watch this video without reading the book at all, but I hope that in what we say and what we do in our book club will persuade you to take a dip into it. In talking about the videos to follow, I should just explain that in the introductory talk I'm giving now, I'll refer to one or two places in Robert Burton's own introduction to his book, which is contained on pages 11 to 13 of the Stan's Cafe adaptation, and on pages 2 to 16 of the Robbins abridgment. And then, in subsequent weeks, there'll be videos covering each of the book's 3 partitions. And between videos, we'll use Twitter to remind you of the book club and invite you into a community of readers. That's the museum's own Twitter account. If you are watching this video on YouTube or Facebook, of course, you can use those platforms to like and make comments, and we can start a discussion that way. Once you've finished watching this video, I invite you to read the introduction to the Anatomy of Melancholy, pages 11 to 13 of Stan's Cafe, 2 to 16 of the Robbins version. That is, if you haven't read the introduction already. And then, over the next week, try to read the first partition, in time for the release of the next video on the museum's social media platforms. I hope all that makes sense. In introducing the Anatomy of Melancholy, Burton explains its title as follows, on page 12 of Stan's Cafe and page 16 in Robbins. My purpose and endeavour is to anatomise this humour of melancholy through all its parts and species, to show the causes, symptoms, and several cures of it, that it may be the better avoided. He wants to break it down into its constituent parts so as to understand, describe, and address it as well as he can. Taking a different metaphor, he might have called the book a taxonomy of melancholy, or an encyclopedia of melancholy. If he were writing today, he might have called it Melancholy for Dummies, or An Idiot's Guide to Melancholy. Burton makes sure that his readers understand that in writing about melancholy, he knows what he's talking about. I write of melancholy, he says on page 6 of the Robbins edition, or I perform of melancholy on page 12 of the Stan's Cafe edition, which was written for the stage. I write of melancholy by being busy to avoid melancholy. As he that is stung with a scorpion, I would make an antidote out of that which was the prime cause of my disease. In other words, Burton is a wounded healer. He has first-person experience of melancholy, and he utilises that first-person experience to do two things. First, as a form of self-therapy, to keep his own melancholy at bay, and second, to provide wise and reliable counsel to others. In his introduction, Burton drives home the point that when it comes to melancholy, we are all in need of wise counsel. There's a passage on page 12 in the Stan's Cafe version, which isn't included in the Robbins edition, which reads as follows. Melancholy is a disease so frequent, so few there are that feel not the smart of it. It is so common in this crazed age of ours, that scarce 1 in 1,000 is free of it. And then Burton says something about mental health which is worth remembering at any time when there's a health scare or a public health emergency. He writes, if we labour of a disease, a bodily disease, we send for a physician. But for the diseases of the mind, we take no notice of them. We are torn in pieces by our passions. But which of us seeks for help, acknowledges his error, or even knows that he is sick? The present coronavirus epidemic has closed many doors, including that of Bethlem Museum of the Mind. And we're concerned about the mental health effects of the social distance we're required to maintain from one another these days. Robert Burton's insights into melancholia's causes, characteristics and cures are idiosyncratic, they are unreliable, and of course they are dated. But they are always entertaining, and from time to time they are right on point. I trust that this is what you will find as you read the introduction and first partition to the Anatomy of Melancholy in whatever abridged version you have, or are able to obtain. Take care, and we'll see you next time.